Sometimes, the most haunting stories begin not with a scream, but with a silence so heavy it bends the air. That's how it started on a Saturday morning in September 2007, amid the noise and rush of Grand Central Terminal, the kind of place where people are always going somewhere fast. Except for one little girl who wasn't going anywhere at all. She was 3 years old. Her face, delicate and still. Her eyes, wide and empty. She stood alone near the station's East Ticket concourse, not crying, not calling out, just holding a worn-out stuffed rabbit with one arm and twisting the hem of her dress with the other. It was a soft pink cotton dress, decorated with tiny orange pumpkins. That detail would later make the headlines. They called her Little Pumpkin. At first, passers-by assumed she had wandered off. A distracted parent. A momentary lapse. Someone would come running back for her. But no one did. A transit officer finally approached her, gently knelt down and asked, "Where's your mommy, sweetheart?" The girl blinked. No response. He tried again in Spanish. Then in broken Mandarin. Still nothing. The officer radioed it in, and within minutes, Child Protective Services and NYPD officers were on site. The girl remained quiet. No name. No tears. Just a kind of stillness that made everyone in the room uneasy. They gave her apple juice, a small blanket, and a soft plush cat from the lost and found box. She hugged it but wouldn't speak. No signs of injury. No bruises, no fever, just that haunted silence. She didn't flinch when someone raised their voice across the room. She didn't react when a phone rang suddenly near her ear. But when they turned on the station's surveillance monitor, something flickered in her eyes. And that was when they saw him. The video showed a tall Asian man in his early 50s, walking into Grand Central with the girl's tiny hand in his. He wore dark pants, a light jacket, and pulled a black rolling suitcase behind him. At exactly 7:22 a.m., he bent down beside her, said something close to her ear, then walked toward the escalators, alone. He never looked back. He never returned. From that moment on, the mystery stopped being about a lost child. It became a hunt for the man who left her behind. The child had no ID, no luggage, no accompanying adult name on record. The only clue was the brand of her dress, Pumpkin Patch, a popular children's clothing line, and the image of the man in the surveillance footage. Local officers quickly contacted airports, bus depots, and nearby hotels. And by early afternoon, they had a lead. Flight records revealed that the man, David Yuan, had boarded a one-way flight to Phoenix, Arizona, just under 3 hours after abandoning the girl. He had used a valid U.S. passport. The ticket had been booked 2 days in advance. He was traveling alone. But what struck investigators wasn't just that he had left the girl behind. It was that he had planned to. A hotel clerk near Penn Station confirmed that David had checked in with a little girl the night before. Room 304. 2 guests. Quiet. No room service, no disturbances. He left early the next morning with his suitcase. The girl, apparently, wasn't with him when he left. The clerk assumed they had checked out separately. That theory didn't hold. Investigators cross-referenced MTA cameras. The footage confirmed. David brought the girl to Grand Central, then walked away. Alone. The clock was ticking. While the girl stayed in the protective care of New York's Child Services, officers back in New Jersey, where David's last known residence was located, paid a visit to his listed address in Newark. Neighbors were cooperative. One said, "I haven't seen him in days. But his garage door was open last night, which was weird." Another mentioned a woman. A younger woman. She lived with him. Sweet girl. Not much English, but she always waved. Her name was Lena Chin. Officers knocked. No answer. They called out. Nothing. They walked around the side yard and peered into the garage window. That's when they saw it. A dark red Toyota Camry, parked awkwardly, with what looked like a blanket stuffed into the rear window. The license plate matched David's name. They pried open the garage and unlocked the trunk. The smell hit first. Wrapped inside a comforter, tied with duct tape, was the body of a young Asian woman. Lifeless. Dressed in a light nightgown, barefoot. A yellow martial arts belt had been knotted tightly around her neck. The woman had been dead for several days. The autopsy later confirmed the cause of death, manual strangulation. No defensive wounds. No signs of sexual assault. But the bruising around the throat was deep and deliberate. It was not an accident. It was not spontaneous. It was personal. Back at Child Services, a Mandarin-speaking therapist was brought in to speak with the girl. Gently, over several sessions, the child began to talk. Fragments, mostly. Simple words. Mama. Sleep. Car ride. Pumpkin. One sentence stood out. Daddy said no looking back. That same phrase appeared later in a scribbled note found in David's kitchen drawer. No looking back. She chose her path. I'll choose mine. By this point, the media had caught wind of the case. Little Pumpkin made headlines across the country. The New York Post ran the story under the title, "Girl Left Behind, Mother Found Dead, Father on the Run." But what they didn't yet know was that this wasn't just a story of abandonment or domestic violence. This was the unraveling of a man who had lived behind a mask for decades, and the tiny, silent witness who survived him. What lay ahead would involve state lines, false identities, and a final takedown in the last place anyone expected. David Yuan was not the kind of man who made a strong impression at first glance. He didn't command a room with charisma. He didn't radiate charm. But what he lacked in presence, he made up for in control. Quiet control. Calculated control. And for most of his life, that had been enough. Born in 1954 in Guangzhou, China, David had grown up in a home where silence was expected and obedience was survival. His father, a former soldier turned local martial arts instructor, believed discipline was love and beatings were lessons. David learned early that power wasn't just about strength, it was about being the one who set the rules, the one who didn't flinch, the one who always stood 2 steps behind but pulled all the strings. By the late 1980s, David had immigrated to the U.S., settling first in San Francisco's Chinatown, where he taught Tai Chi in public parks and rented a corner space in a strip mall dojo. He was never famous, not even in martial arts circles. But he told stories about the Shaolin influence in his lineage, about how he once trained under a monk who could stop a blade with bare hands. Most of it wasn't true, but in the right circles, few asked. He married a woman 10 years younger than him. They had a daughter. That marriage didn't last. When David left California for New Jersey in the early 2000s, he was starting over, again. This time, he told people he was a 6th-generation martial arts master, a teacher of internal power and spiritual balance. He handed out business cards printed on thick, gold-trimmed stock. On them, beneath a dragon emblem, were the words, Master David Yuan, Traditional Tai Chi, Strength Through Stillness. But the dojo was never busy. His students came and went, mostly middle-aged men looking for gentle exercise or cultural connection. Some stayed for a few months, some for a few years. They liked the incense, the calm music, the rituals. Few asked why there were no competitions. No real sparring. No demonstrations. David's strength didn't lie in combat. It lay in image. In control. And when control began to slip, so did his sanity. In 2002, he met Lena Chin. She had arrived in the U.S. only months earlier, lured by the promise of a scholarship at a language school in Newark that turned out to be a scam. Her visa was tied to the school. No enrollment meant no legal status. She was 22, alone, afraid, and running out of money. They met at a community center. David was teaching a free demonstration class. Lena sat in the back, not for the martial arts, but for the air conditioning. He noticed her immediately. After class, he approached, asked where she was from, complimented her Mandarin, asked if she needed help. She moved into his spare room 10 days later. It began, like many stories of quiet abuse do, with kindness. He offered her food, gave her space to study, promised to help her stay in the country. He was patient, supportive. He said all the right things. For a while. But slowly, the kindness became conditional. She wasn't allowed to talk to male classmates. He began tracking where she went. She had to check in before going anywhere. He read her emails. He told her she didn't need to work. He would provide everything. And for a while he did. By the time Lena realized how trapped she was, She already felt like she owed him too much to walk away. In 2003, she got pregnant. David was ecstatic. Told everyone they were married, even though there was no license. He framed an ultrasound on the wall of the dojo. Told his students the baby would inherit his legacy. Lena didn't resist. Not then. She was scared. Alone. Her family in China had no idea what was happening. She stopped writing. Stopped calling. Their daughter, Emily, was born later that year. David insisted she carry his surname. He called her the next generation of strength. But in private, the pressure on Lena grew heavier. David's dojo was failing. Students were leaving. Rent was overdue. He began lashing out. He blamed Lena. Called her lazy. Unfaithful. A distraction. He shoved her against walls. Locked her out of the house in winter. Screamed at her in front of the baby. Once, when Emily was 2, Lena forgot to refill the gas tank. David threw a chair across the kitchen and told her she was trying to sabotage him. In 2006, Lena tried to leave. She fled with Emily to a women's shelter, reported the abuse, and began filing for a restraining order. David was arrested but released within 48 hours. Lena, terrified he'd find her, never followed through with the case. She said she didn't want Emily to grow up with her father in jail. In truth, she was too scared. They moved back in together later that year. But something had changed. Lena no longer smiled. She no longer spoke unless spoken to. She never went out alone. And David's paranoia deepened. By early 2007, David's finances had collapsed. The dojo closed. He filed for bankruptcy. The house was in pre-foreclosure. He blamed Lena for everything. For ruining his image. For stealing his energy. For making him weak. When Lena finally left for good in the summer of 2007, she took Emily and moved to Chicago. There, she tried to rebuild her life. She worked at a bakery. Made friends. Laughed again. Wrote poems on a Chinese blog under the name Hidden Water. She met someone. A quiet man who worked in IT. They dated. She wrote about him. He doesn't raise his voice. He listens. He doesn't ask where I've been. David found the blog in early September. He knew immediately. The tone. The references. The photos. She had moved on. She had replaced him. He sent her a message. I'm not angry. I just want to see Emily. She agreed to meet. Said it would only be for a day. Just long enough for Emily to say goodbye. Lena boarded a Greyhound bus on September 10th. She told her boyfriend she'd be back the next night. She never made it. On the morning of September 11th, neighbors saw David backing his Toyota Camry into the garage. No one saw Lena arrive. No one heard a struggle. On September 13th, David bought 2 one-way train tickets, 1 adult, 1 child. New Jersey to New York. That same day, he booked a one-way flight from JFK to Phoenix. And on the morning of September 15th, he walked his 3-year-old daughter into Grand Central Terminal, whispered something in her ear, turned his back, and vanished. Emily, in her pumpkin dress, watched him walk away, just like her mother had once watched him do the same to everyone who dared love him. Only this time, someone would follow him. And this time, someone would not stop. When David Yuan boarded a plane bound for Phoenix, Arizona, on the morning of September 15, 2007, he thought he had escaped. He believed he had executed the perfect disappearing act. Left no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no connections that could lead anyone to where he was headed. What he didn't understand was that silence leaves a trail just as loud as a scream when people know where to listen. Back in Newark, the investigation was accelerating. Lena Chen's body had been discovered, bound in a blanket and stuffed into the trunk of David's Camry. Her death was ruled a homicide, and her daughter had already been found abandoned days earlier at Grand Central. The pieces were connecting faster than David had ever imagined. The media called him the disappearing Sifu. Headlines in New York and New Jersey plastered his face alongside photos of Little Pumpkin, his daughter Emily, in her pumpkin dress, clinging to a stuffed rabbit. The story had every element the public couldn't look away from: a martial arts master with a violent past, a murdered wife, a vanished fugitive, and a voiceless child at the center of it all. What law enforcement feared most now was that David would vanish again, slipping into the underbelly of another city, assuming a new name, just as he had done so many times before. But David was not a professional criminal. He was prideful, habitual, and in his arrogance, he left patterns. The FBI issued a federal arrest warrant and added him to the National Fugitive Watch list. Flyers went out to every state. His passport was flagged. His face was featured on America's Most Wanted, and tips began to trickle in. Some were dead ends, an older Asian man spotted at a truck stop in Nevada, another working in a Florida kitchen. But one detail gave investigators pause. He had no luggage. The airline confirmed that David checked in with only a single small carry-on. He had no checked bags. No ID for the child. No cash withdrawals after his arrival. He had vanished into Phoenix without a trace. But something else was happening. Within the Chinese-American communities across the country, particularly among restaurant workers and immigrants who had built tight-knit networks out of survival and solidarity, the story was spreading. And they recognized David, not just from the news, but from memory. Not as David Yuan, but under a different name. In a small restaurant in a suburb of Tucson, Arizona, a kitchen prep cook named Tommy Chin began to have doubts about the quiet, tense man who had recently started bussing tables under the name Daniel Wong. He spoke fluent Mandarin with a northern accent and claimed he was from Flushing, Queens. He didn't carry a phone, paid only in cash, and refused to talk about his past. Tommy remembered a story his cousin had shared from New Jersey about a Tai Chi instructor accused of killing his wife and dumping his daughter at a train station. Tommy pulled up the news article on a backroom desktop and stared at the face on screen. It was him. He contacted 4 of his closest friends, delivery drivers and former factory workers from their hometown in Guangdong. None of them spoke much English. All of them were immigrants. But they had seen too many stories like Lena's to stay silent. They called the local police tip line, tried to explain, but the operator dismissed their concerns after struggling with the language barrier. The next day they tried again, and again. Frustrated and desperate, they decided they couldn't wait anymore. They began watching Daniel. His habits. When he came to work. What he carried. Whether he packed a bag. He was cautious, paranoid, never stayed in one place more than 2 nights. But one thing they noticed, he always kept a red duffel bag near his feet, even while eating. On February 28, 2008, nearly 6 months after the murder, the group put their plan into motion. They invited Daniel to dinner after work. Said it was a friend's birthday. Laughed, clapped him on the back, poured drinks. When he hesitated, they insisted, too much warmth, too much attention. He reluctantly agreed. In the parking lot, as he reached for his keys, one of the men blocked his path. Another wrapped his arms around his waist. A third tackled him low, and the fourth bound his wrists with leather belts. It happened in under 10 seconds. When the police arrived, David Yuan was already face down on the asphalt, bleeding from his lip, breathing heavily, his hands and feet bound. In his wallet was a fake Arizona ID. In his bag was a burner phone, $300 in cash, and a photo of Emily. His fingerprints confirmed what they already knew. The arrest made headlines nationwide. The 5 men who captured David were hailed as heroes in the Chinese-American press. They refused the $10,000 reward, asking instead that it be donated to domestic violence shelters for all the women who never get out. Their faces never made it onto primetime news. But in their own way, they delivered justice when the system struggled to catch up. David was extradited back to New Jersey within a week. He was placed in maximum security detention, held without bail. The trial would come next, but even before a jury heard a single word, the nation had already formed its verdict. He was the man who left a 3-year-old girl alone in a station. The man who killed a woman for choosing her own life. The man who thought he could disappear. But what David never understood was this: when you burn everything behind you, someone will always follow the smoke. The courtroom in Newark was cold, even in July. The kind of cold that doesn't come from air conditioning but from something else entirely, an unspoken heaviness, a silence thick with anticipation. Reporters sat in the back row, pens ready. Prosecutors shuffled papers. family advocates held their breath. And in the middle of it all, David Yuan stood quietly at the defendant's table, wearing a gray suit that didn't quite fit and a face that revealed nothing. It had been over a year since Lena Chen was murdered and her daughter Emily left alone at Grand Central. The country had watched the story unfold like a slow-moving train wreck, one detail at a time, each more disturbing than the last. Now, it was time for justice to speak. But justice, like David, didn't speak much. The trial began on June 2, 2009, in the Superior Court of Essex County, New Jersey. The prosecution brought with them a timeline, a body, DNA evidence, and a motive as old as betrayal itself. The defense brought doubt, ambiguity, and a strategy that left even seasoned legal analysts unsettled. What should have been a clear-cut case, husband murders wife, flees the state, abandons child, turned into a debate over details. A slow unraveling of what could be proven versus what could be suggested. It wasn't that the facts were missing. It was that they were distorted, blurred, like fingerprints wiped too late. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. Lena Chen was last seen alive at 4:17 p.m. on September 11, 2007, picking up Emily from a children's center in Newark. A neighbor reported hearing a woman crying later that night, followed by a loud slam and silence. 2 days later, David booked one-way tickets, and within hours of arriving in New York, left Emily at the train station and fled to Arizona. Inside David's car, Lena's body was found wrapped in a blanket, tied with a yellow martial arts belt. She was wearing a nightgown, no shoes, no underwear. Nearby, investigators discovered a plastic bag containing a red pair of panties with mixed DNA, 3 contributors, David, Lena, and 2 unidentified males. The belt, tied in a specific knot used in martial arts routines, had only one clear fingerprint, David's. But the defense leaned heavily into that DNA. They claimed it was proof of infidelity, that Lena had been with other men, that she had hidden things, that she had lived a double life in Chicago. They even pointed to her private blog, which contained vague romantic references and a few blurred photos of another man's silhouette. They painted her as someone who was unstable, impulsive, and potentially engaged in what they called consensual rough intimacy that may have gone too far. Then came their central argument: David didn't kill her. He found her dead. According to his lawyers, David had returned home that evening to discover Lena lifeless, already strangled by someone she had brought into the house. Panicked, he claimed to have moved her body into the trunk, afraid of being blamed. They said he ran, not out of guilt, but fear. The courtroom was stunned. 4 days, forensic experts were called to dispute the claim. They testified about the bruising on Lena's neck, the angle of pressure, the lack of defensive wounds. They said the crime scene suggested the attack happened inside the house, likely in the living room, with no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints belonging to anyone but David and Lena. They confirmed the yellow belt used was from David's own collection, custom stitched with his name in Mandarin on the inner seam. Still, the defense held their ground. They raised doubt after doubt. They questioned the timeline, the forensic interpretations, the reliability of witness memories. One even suggested the possibility that someone else had planted the body, though no evidence supported that claim. When Emily was brought up, now 5 years old, the judge ruled that she was too young to testify. Her taped interviews were deemed inadmissible due to leading questions. Her only statement on record, "Daddy said don't look back," was powerful but ultimately circumstantial. Lena's parents, who had flown in from California, sat in silence during the proceedings. Her mother held a locket containing a photo of Lena in her graduation gown, something she had never gotten to wear. Her father never spoke publicly, but reporters noted that he stared at David for the duration of the trial without blinking. In total, the trial lasted 4 weeks, with over 90 witnesses called. The jury, 7 women, 5 men, deliberated for nearly 2 full days. On June 20, 2009, they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, abandonment of a child, and obstruction of justice. David showed no emotion. Not when the verdict was read. Not when the judge asked if he had anything to say. He only muttered, "It's not fair," under his breath. Later, he was heard saying, "The jury was all women," as if that were somehow the flaw in the system that had just declared him guilty. At sentencing, held on July 31st, the judge called David's actions cold, deliberate, and cowardly. He was given a life sentence, with no possibility of parole for at least 12 years. For many it felt too light. Lena's life had ended in silence. Emily's had been altered forever. And David, in many ways, still had control over the narrative, over the courtroom, over what he chose to say or not say. After the trial, David refused all interviews. But in prison, he began writing. He called it "I Am Not a Murderer," a self-published memoir distributed through underground martial arts forums. In it, he claimed Lena's death was an accident, that the media had lied, that his daughter had been taken from him by enemies of his work. He never once mentioned remorse. But the silence of that courtroom still lingers. Because in the end, it wasn't just about what David said. It was about what he didn't. The choices he made, the woman he destroyed, the child he left behind, all in silence. Justice may have been served. But healing is a different kind of sentence. While the courtroom deliberated and the world followed the headlines, Emily Yuan, known only to most as Little Pumpkin, was tucked away in a quiet foster home on the outskirts of Queens, New York. She was 5 years old by the time her father's trial began. She didn't understand words like defendant, autopsy, or parole eligibility. She only knew that everyone around her spoke softly when they talked about her mother, and that no one said the word father anymore. Her name had been whispered into national consciousness, not by her voice, but by the silence she carried. When she was found at Grand Central Terminal, she had no ID. No language that could connect her to her mother. No memory detailed enough to explain the terror she had lived through. The media gave her a nickname. The police gave her a file number. The state gave her a caseworker. But no one could give her back what she had lost. Emily's earliest weeks in foster care were quiet. She rarely spoke, barely ate, and resisted physical contact from strangers. Social workers described her as emotionally frozen. She didn't throw tantrums. She didn't cry. She simply stopped. The only thing she held onto was a white stuffed rabbit, worn, stained at the ears, with one eye missing. It had been with her the morning she was abandoned. No one had the heart to replace it. At first, the state struggled to find family. Lena Chin had no siblings. Her parents, elderly and living in California, had never met David. They hadn't even known their granddaughter existed until reporters came knocking on their door after the body was identified. Her mother, Maylin, flew to New Jersey immediately, a suitcase in one hand and a photo of her daughter in the other. The first meeting between Emily and her grandmother was quiet and cautious. Maylin knelt down in the foster home's front room, held out the photo of Lena, and said softly in Mandarin, "This is your mama." Emily looked at the photo, then at the woman holding it. She didn't smile. But she didn't look away. That was the beginning. Over the next 6 months, Maylin fought to gain full custody. It wasn't easy. The system required background checks, home studies, language evaluations. She was nearly 70, widowed, and on a fixed income. But what she lacked in resources, she made up for in resolve. "I couldn't save my daughter," she told the court, "but I will not let her child be forgotten." The state agreed. In early 2010, Emily left New York for California, holding her grandmother's hand the entire way through the airport. That would be the last time she ever set foot on the East Coast. In the years that followed, Emily grew up in a modest home in San Gabriel Valley, surrounded by the slow rhythms of suburban life, weekend markets, temple visits, and a school where most of the kids spoke some version of what she understood. Her grandmother enrolled her in Mandarin lessons, therapy sessions, and art classes. And she never spoke of her father. But the past, like a shadow at sundown, never truly goes away. Emily had questions, some spoken, some only felt. Why did her mother leave Chicago that week? Why didn't anyone stop it? Why did her father smile in the photo on the news? She asked them in pieces, over years, never all at once. Maylin answered the same way. Slowly, gently, truthfully. She never showed her the photos from the trial. Never talked about the belt or the autopsy or the blogs. But she told her that her mother was brave, that she had tried to protect her, that love wasn't supposed to hurt. Emily grew up with two identities, one she carried in her legal documents, and one the country had given her, Little Pumpkin. At school, she avoided attention. When teachers brought up stranger danger or missing children, she doodled in the margins. When Father's Day came around, she stayed home sick. In middle school, she stopped using her last name. In high school, she took therapy more seriously. She never returned to Newark, never visited the house. But she kept a small box in her bedroom. Inside, the rabbit, the dress, and a copy of a faded news clipping with a yellow headline, "Girl Left Behind, Father Vanishes After Mother Found Dead." She didn't keep it out of nostalgia. She kept it as a reminder. Because by then, Emily knew something no one had told her: survival is not the same as healing. In 2020, Emily turned 16. She asked her grandmother a question she had never asked before: "Did he ever say sorry?" Malin paused, then nodded. She explained that in 2019, David had filed for parole. 12 years had passed. He had written a letter to the board expressing remorse. He admitted he had made mistakes, that he had regrets. He said he missed his daughter. But the board denied his request. Psychological evaluations showed that David Yuan had a high risk of narcissistic tendencies and control-based behavior patterns that present continued risk. The panel wrote, while the inmate demonstrates verbal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, he fails to show emotional integration of remorse. In other words, he knew how to say the right things, but he didn't mean them. Emily read the report in silence. Then, without speaking, she folded it, placed it back into the file, and closed the drawer. That night she wrote in her journal, "He gave me nothing. My mother gave me everything. And I survived." Today, Emily Chin does not use her birth name. She attends community college, studying early childhood development. She volunteers part-time at a shelter for survivors of domestic abuse. No one there knows her past. No one connects her to the headlines. And that's how she wants it. Because for all the noise that once surrounded her, for all the cameras and articles and courtroom silence, Emily has learned the quietest victories are the most powerful. She is no longer the girl in the pumpkin dress. She is not the daughter of a murderer. She is her mother's legacy. And she is still writing the rest of her story. 2 months after the verdict, the wooden doors of Grace Sanctuary opened once again for Sunday morning service. The same sunlight poured through the stained glass windows. The same pews stood polished and lined. But the air was different. The pulpit was empty. Pastor Kane Barrett was no longer the voice behind it. And Harlem was still healing. The church without its shepherd. Grace Sanctuary tried to move forward. The board appointed an interim pastor, a young, mild-mannered minister from Queens named Elijah Cross, who spoke softly and avoided eye contact with the front row. He didn't mention Kane. He didn't speak of the trial. But the congregation did. Whispers filled the narthex. He was framed. They made an example of him. But what if he did it? Attendance dropped by nearly 40% in the weeks following the sentencing. Some families never returned. Others came, but sat in silence. The choir sang louder, as if trying to drown out the doubt. Outside, graffiti still stained the stone steps. You can't wash away what bled inside. It had been scrubbed 3 times. It always came back. Miguel's mission. While the church wrestled with silence, Miguel Rivera refused to stay quiet. He launched a community initiative called The Second Room, inspired by the apartment Elliot had once dreamed of transforming into a counseling center. Miguel partnered with Columbia University's psychology department and a local nonprofit to turn Elliot's former apartment into a functioning drop-in center for young adults. Inside were shelves of books on theology and trauma recovery, a prayer wall, and a photo of Elliot near the door. He wanted a place where people could speak their truth without fear, Miguel told the press. So now we're building it. By August, over 300 young people had visited the second room. Some were LGBTQ+ teens kicked out of their homes. Some were former churchgoers, questioning their faith. Some were survivors of clergy abuse. All of them carried stories. All of them had nowhere else to go. Until now. Kane's prison letters. From his cell at Attica Correctional Facility, Kane Barrett began writing letters. They weren't to the court, or to Miguel. They were addressed to his congregation. And they were signed with his full title, Reverend Dr. Kane Isaiah Barrett, Servant of the Word. In the letters he didn't confess, but he didn't fully deny. I have been judged in a court of man, but not in the court of heaven. Even a shepherd may be struck, but the sheep must stay strong. I forgive those who betrayed me, and pray for those who doubt me. Some read the letters aloud during small gatherings. Others tore them up on sight. But the letters spread. Online. In print. In whispers. Kane still had followers. The media moves on, but Harlem doesn't. True crime podcasts moved to new stories. Netflix called Miguel for a possible documentary. He declined. The headlines faded from national view. But in Harlem, the echoes remained. A young artist painted a mural of Elliot Rivera on a community wall in Marcus Garvey Park. He's shown standing in a hoodie, Bible in one hand, a golden halo faintly behind his head, not saintly but determined. Underneath, a quote reads, "Truth doesn't come from silence. It comes from standing in it." The pain behind the praise. Not everyone celebrated Elliot. Some former Grace members blamed him for Kane's downfall. Some accused him of betrayal. He bit the hand that fed him, one woman muttered outside a grocery store. He could have handled it internally, another said. But others knew better. The trauma Elliot uncovered, the financial abuse, the spiritual manipulation, the layers of control masked as care, wasn't unique to one church. In the months following the trial, 3 other churches across the state were investigated for similar issues. 2 pastors stepped down quietly. Elliot's name kept surfacing. He'd become something more than a victim. He'd become a symbol. A city learns to speak again. In October 2021, Columbia University hosted a symposium titled, "The Cost of Silence, Faith, Power, and Accountability in Modern Ministry." Miguel gave the keynote. His words were raw, not rehearsed. This isn't just about Elliot. This is about every person who saw something wrong and didn't know how to say it. Every young man who trusted someone older and got pulled under. Every shepherd who forgot that leadership isn't control, it's protection. The audience gave a standing ovation. But Miguel didn't smile. He simply looked up at the ceiling lights, eyes shining, and whispered, "I hope you're proud of me, hermano." Meanwhile, in cell 311, Kane sat alone in the prison chapel that same night. No one else was there. He opened his Bible to Psalm 27. He read the words aloud. "Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident." He closed the book, sighed, and looked out the barred window. "They still don't understand," he muttered. "They never understood." There's a moment in every long tragedy when silence becomes permanent. Not the silence of grief or of shock, but the kind that settles after all the courtrooms have closed, the reporters have moved on, and the cameras stop clicking. It's the silence where legacy begins. For most people, David Yuan's name faded with the headlines. He became one of many men sentenced for killing a woman who once trusted him. His face, once plastered across screens and news tickers, now lived only in archived footage, court transcripts, and the occasional thread on forgotten forums. He remains in Northern State Prison. Still alive. Still writing. Still believing that one day, someone might listen. But beyond those gray walls, the world kept turning, and in that world, Emily, the girl once known only as Little Pumpkin, has grown into someone else entirely. At 23, she works as a case assistant for a nonprofit that supports domestic violence survivors in Southern California. She doesn't advertise her past. Most of her coworkers don't know the story. She's not hiding, but she's not performing either. Her life is not a headline. She lives with her grandmother, Mei Lin, in a small 2-bedroom home. They drink jasmine tea together on weekends. Emily pays half the rent. Mei Lin still wakes up at 5:30 every morning and reads the newspaper aloud in Mandarin. Some mornings, Emily translates the complicated parts. They both laugh at the horoscope section, even though neither believes in it. Emily doesn't use the name Yuan anymore. She legally changed it at 18. Her ID now reads Emily Chen, and with it, she took back something that was never his to give, her future. But the past isn't something that simply disappears. It lives in moments. In how she turns towards sounds behind her. In how she locks the door twice at night. In how she flinches at yelling, even if it's from a television in another room. She's learned to live with it. Not bury it, not ignore it, but live beside it. In 2022, she was invited to speak at a closed-session survivors forum. Not as a case study. Not as a symbol. Just as a person who made it through. She told them what it was like to grow up without knowing what happened, but feeling the weight of it anyway. She talked about the nightmares. The stares at school. The year she stopped speaking altogether. The way people whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. And she told them about her mother. Not about the crime. Not the yellow belt. Not the photos in evidence boxes. She spoke about how her mother once sang to her in the kitchen while making kanji. About how she wrote tiny poems in the margins of her planner. About how she had a laugh that made Emily feel like the world was still good, even if only for a second. When she finished, someone in the audience asked her, "Do you think you've forgiven him?" She paused. Then said, "I don't think forgiveness is the goal. Accountability is." And with that, she sat down. Across the country, David Yuan received a letter that same year. It wasn't from Emily. It was from the Department of Corrections. A formal notice informing him that another parole review would not be granted for 5 more years. No appeal. No reconsideration. Psychological reviews remained unchanged. His legacy, once imagined as a long martial arts lineage, had calcified into something else. A man remembered not for mastery, but for betrayal. His students had moved on. His former dojo was now idolatry. His name, once spoken with deference, was now an afterthought. But legacy isn't only about the person who created it. Sometimes it's about who survives it. Today, Emily keeps one small box tucked away in her closet. It contains just 4 items. The pumpkin dress she wore that morning at Grand Central. The one-eyed rabbit. A photo of her mother holding her as a baby. And the letter she wrote to herself the night she turned 16. She doesn't look at it often. But she doesn't throw it away either. Because memory, like legacy, isn't always there to hurt. Sometimes, it's there to remind us who we are despite what happened. In the end, this wasn't a story about martial arts. Or the justice system. Or even murder. It was a story about power. The kind of power that controls. The kind that kills. And the kind that survives. David Yuan believed power came from silence. From fear. From control. But Emily Chen knows something different now. She knows that true power isn't in what we inherit. It's in what we choose to carry. And more importantly, in what we choose to let go.